Okay, let's move forward. We've got what about an hour and a half left now to our time together on this topic. So I'd like to again just briefly go through this. This can be a rather long teaching, and if you're really interested in the whole Tibetan Buddhist view of what happens at death, there's a wonderful book by the Dalai Lama that's called Mind of Clear Light, I think is the name that it was republished under. Initially, it was called something like Advice for Living a Better Life or something, but it's called The Mind of Clear Light. The actual death process is laid out in Buddhism. Let me actually throw a few quotes. Yeah, that's the name of the book. It's cited here on the slides. Again, when we make these slides available, I'll get them to Bay either later today or tomorrow at the latest, a full set of these so that you can have them to refer to. So when the actual process of dying begins, you pass through 8 phases, or they're sometimes called 8 dissolutions. The first 4 involve the collapse of the 4 elements, the 4 elements being earth, water, fire, and air or wind. The last 4 involve the collapse of consciousness into the innermost level of mind, called the mind of clear light, hence the title of this book. And this is, again, teachings, before we go too far in this, I might mention these are teachings that come from primarily the Tantric Buddhism point of view. In some of the higher classes of Tantra, they teach this as, and it even comes out of the Book of the Dead, and essentially from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, these phases are taught as a gradual process that if someone is going through a gradual death, of course, if it's a very sudden death, I've got a slide pertaining to that in a moment, you'll go through these really quickly. If death happens really quite suddenly, then you won't have this kind of elongated going through these various phases. But this is, again, based on the fact that our consciousness has different levels to it. We have this extremely subtle level that is the mind of clear light, that is sort of like the thread that goes through all of our existences. Then we have a subtler, but not as subtle as the mind of clear light, a couple of states of mind that do manifest at death that are kind of precursors to getting to that mind of clear light. And then we have the grossest level, which are what we deal with in our everyday life. The grosser measures of consciousness that we have that are involved in our sensory consciousnesses, as well as our mental consciousness, our conceptual mind, thinking about things, and so on. Now, again, that's very different. The grosser level of consciousness is going to be different depending upon what being we're born as. If you're born as a dog, well, your gross consciousness is a dog's consciousness with the sensitivities to smell and things that a dog has and the limited intellectual capability that a dog has. All of that is going to be the grosser consciousness that's dictated by the physical form that you're embodying. But that grosser level of consciousness is then very life bound. So you have that for the duration of this life. So when it falls away at death, of course, that's all something you never experience again because that was the consciousness of that life, the grosser level. But you can then fall down into the subtler levels and you go through those and then you finally get to the subtlemost level. And the subtlemost level, this mind of clear light, is always there. One analogy, I think it was John Landau, who lives on the West Coast here, who's a teacher in our tradition for many years. I think he used this analogy where we can say it's sort of like if you have, imagine it's daytime and you have a lamp that is on a table outside with it being turned on. And then on the table where the lamp is a stick of incense that is lit so that the ember would be there. In the daylight, you don't see the lamp being on and the ember of the incense, right? Because they're blocked by the light that is the grosser light that we're dealing with from the sun. That's our gross level of consciousness, and that's mostly what we deal with. The subtler level only happens when the sun goes down, and then you have the lamp on the table that you can see the illumination of that. That's the subtler minds that arise at death. But then to see the ember of the incense, you have to turn that light off, and then you'll see the ember of the incense glowing very brightly in the darkness of all those other consciousnesses having ceased, those other lights having been extinguished. So it's a similar analogy. What happens is we do always have this subtlemost mind that is like that burning ember of the incense, and the subtler minds that are kind of gathered around it. They're always sort of there, but we just don't access them. Now, they do say that at certain moments in our lives, we access them really briefly, like when you sneeze or when you faint, or even they say when you have orgasm. That these consciousnesses you kind of pass into, but you don't really hold on to the experience of them. At death, if you're having a gradual death, they are more noticeable, where actually you can, as the subjective awareness going through all of this, be cognizant of what is going on and the stages of dissolution of these grosser levels of awareness falling away and the subtler ones coming to the forefront. And then those subtler ones falling away, and then the subtlemost mind arising. That subtlemost mind is free of all conceptuality. It is a pure raw awareness, in a sense, that we can tap into and utilize at the time of death if we have some wherewithal in our spiritual practice. In fact, they say many great tantric practitioners use the death process to manifest that mind because that's the most powerful mind for actualizing this realization of emptiness and actualizing all the other elements of tantric practice. You actually obtain that state of enlightenment in the death process. But that's, again, for those great practitioners who have that ability, who've engaged in tantric empowerment and tantric practice throughout their life. But these are going to happen for us regardless of what our level of spiritual development is, but at least having an awareness of what happens at death. And this is one presentation. Maybe modern science has some idea what goes on at death, though it doesn't seem like they have that good of an idea. But this is a way to give us some assurance that what is going on at death, if this is how it actually is a process of these consciousnesses unfolding. So, as I mentioned just a short while ago, even though we all go through the 8 stages at the time of death, what is described here is a gradual death. Those who die violently or suddenly go through the stages very, very quickly. This is from Lama Zopa's book, How to Enjoy Death, Preparing to Meet Life's Final Challenges Without Fear. It's a kind of an interesting book title, but a lot of practices in it, but also some wonderful teachings about how to prepare for death in terms of what happens. In general, as His Holiness, and I was mentioning what I just said, the grosser elements dissolve into the subtler as the capacity of the former, the grosser ones, to serve as a support for consciousness degenerates, the latter becomes more manifest, just like that light of the lamp becomes more evident when the darkness of the sun is there. When the darkness of the lamp is there, then the ember of the incense is noticeable. This is what's going on for us, is that we are shedding the grosser levels of awareness and the subtler ones are becoming manifest. These are the first four. As it was said in a few slides ago, the first four pertain to dissolution of the elements. They say that the first element, earth element, which is kind of the solidity of the body, that begins to dissolve into the water element. And they say that what occurs at that time, there are a lot of other things. Again, this is like there's a whole section of His Holiness's book that goes into a lot of this as well. But what appears internally, not to your eyes, because actually your eye consciousness is one of the first ones to go, they say. You don't have as much clarity with your eye consciousness at this first dissolution. You have an appearance of a mirage. We've hopefully all seen a mirage or know what a mirage is, seen pictures of it at least, of like water glistening on the horizon. Well, that's what's appearing to our mind's eye, is like this water-like image. It's kind of interesting because, again, Earth is dissolving into water. Water is becoming the basis upon which consciousness is being supported, and water will eventually dissolve, and we'll have it based on fire. Well, when we have water dissolving into fire, when water element dissolves, we have an appearance of smoke. Well, what happens if you put water into a hot thing? You get steam from it or something. Maybe it's not quite the same as smoke, but that's how I remember these, is that you have first that mirage from earth going into water. The smoke appearance arises when water dissolves into fire. The fire element, which is the water element, by the way, are all the liquid elements of our body, the blood and what have you, lymph, all these different more liquid elements. The fire element is represented by the heat in the body. We have all that being generated. The temperature of our body is close to 100 degrees, right? So we have this amazing furnace in our body. That begins to fall away. When you have that and that dissolving into the air element, it's like an appearance of fireflies or sparks within the smoke. Well, here I think about like if you're um, at a fireplace or a campfire outside or something, and you blow on the wood, causes little embers to kind of, little sparks to fly around, kind of see the sparks within the smoke. This is because the fire is being extinguished, that element, and air is arising. Now, the air element in Tantric Buddhism, the air element is the movement through the body of energy. Like, many of you do yoga. In yoga, they talk about prana, and in Chinese medicine, they talk about qi. It's a similar concept that you have subtle energy flows in the body that are essentially wind energies, and you have a number of winds that are indicated and channels that these winds circulate on, and pathways that they go through. Some similar to the way that Chinese medicine talks about meridians and what have you. So air element, the wind element, is the last to dissolve. It's the subtlemost element in the body. Earth being much grosser, wind being a little subtler, fire being subtler than that, and air being the subtlest. When you have the air element dissolving, there's an appearance to the mind's eye again, not to your visual consciousness, of a sputtering flame. It's as if the flame is going out, the flame of that life. These four, when you get through these four and you've experienced the last one with that appearance of this sputtering flame, technically you are dead according to Western science. At this point, you're no longer breathing because wind has stopped. You're no longer engaging in the circulation of winds in the body. Your brain activity is stopped or slowing down. I don't know enough about what all happens there with scientific death, but technically you would be declared dead at this point. In Tibetan Buddhism, you're not dead yet. You haven't gone through the four remaining dissolutions. Everything that happens from here on out cannot be noticed by the observer who is by the bedside, but can be experienced by the person who is going through the death process. So let's look at these. First thing to fall away, to dissolve. These are all going to be kind of mental things that are involved here, not the grosser elements, because we're dealing with the dissolution of these grosser levels of consciousness. The first thing is what are called the 80 gross conceptions. Don't ask me to enumerate them. You don't necessarily even want to hear the list, but all of these grosser conceptions fall away because you are moving into these subtler levels of mind. Remember, there's kind of three levels. There's the grossest level, the subtler levels, and then the extremely subtle level. So the next three that we have, the mind of white appearance, red increase, and black near attainment, are all these subtler levels of mind that manifest when the previous one dissolves. So when the 80 gross conceptions dissolve, the mind of white appearance arises. And this is through this, as it says there on the right-hand side, the appearance is that at first you have this burning butter lamp. After it's been sputtering and whatever, it becomes like this clear sort of white light, like a lamp, a flame. And then a clear vacuity that is filled with white light. That's the mind of white appearance. So again, this isn't appearing to your eye. This is appearing because you're no longer breathing or anything. This is purely within your mental awareness. Is this vast space of vacuity, nothing else in it, but just white light. And it's kind of interesting. I'll take it off screen here. Many people who come back from near-death experiences talk about a white light, right? And this appearance of a white light. It's hard to line up completely all these experiences with what happens in the Tibetan Buddhist view of death, but it makes some sense that people can start moving into this space where they're no longer breathing, their heart isn't beating, they are starting to have these processes unfold. And it seems that it is reversible for some people because they do come out of that near-death experience and speak to what it was like to have that. So there's some validation to some degree of this. I don't know how far you would, if you get to the mind of clear light, you probably are not going to come back because it seems like you would have such changes in the winds, the subtle winds in the body and so on that are talked about at this in this process, that it might be really hard to reverse that. But it would seem that there is some possibility of coming back out of these stages. And that's what we speak to in these near-death experiences. There's some interesting documentation of these sorts of things that you can read about. The next one, the mind of white appearance will now dissolve, and what will come forward is the mind of red increase. Again, this is a subtle change in the mind and in the subtle physiology of the body. These, again, very subtle elements. This is what Tantra is dealing with, and this is what actually happens in our physical bodies, is a subtle process that is occurring. There is an appearance then, as it says there on the second box, very clear vacuity that's filled with red light. They say this is like an autumn sunrise or something, you know. Sometimes you get these amazing red skies, right? That is what is appearing to your mind. It's not like you're looking out at a sky. It's just the mind is clouded with this red, uh, you know, light. It's called the red increase because you're kind of increasing with power towards moving to the mind of clear light, which is the final one we get to. The mind of red increase dissolves into the mind of black near attainment, called near attainment because this is the mind that's nearest to attaining that mind of clear light. So when the mind of red increase falls away and black near attainment comes into our experience, there's at first a vacuity that's filled with thick darkness. That's that black near attainment. But then they say there is a moment where it's almost as if we're losing consciousness. This is our last conceptual mind before the mind of clear light arises. But it's like a swoon. I don't know if you've fainted or something, you kind of experience this where you kind of go black. There's no consciousness of that moment. Consciousness is there. It's not saying it's not there, but you don't have a real deep awareness of what's going on. So that can be probably a little confusing in the death process as you go into this place where it's almost as if you don't have any conscious awareness at all. Then the mind of black near attainment dissolves. And what's number nine, in a sense, it's not a dissolution because it doesn't dissolve, is the mind of clear light. That's what you actually end up in. And that's what the description on the right is then. It's a very clear vacuity appears to the mind now that is free of any other appearances, the mind of clear light of death. So this is, again, in highest yoga tantra, I'll just say this briefly about highest yoga tantra. The techniques are taught to try to induce this mind of clear light while we are still alive, because it is a very powerful state of mind. When it happens at death, it happens naturally, and it happens due to various processes in the body. And again, that makes it very hard to, to reverse. But nonetheless, you can use the mind of clear light at the time of death as a spiritual platform. These great practitioners, as I mentioned a short while ago, if they haven't been able to attain that during this life by engaging in these highest practices of highest yoga tantra, then they can use death as an opportunity to do that. And they say that when you are able to manifest that mind of clear light with the strength of your practice that you've been engaging in and so on through your tantric visualizations and all of that, that you can attain Buddhahood in that process of death. Because death, it doesn't stop there at the mind of clear light. The mind of clear light manifests and is a very powerful non-conceptual mind for doing these spiritual realizations. Then you go into a process of the intermediate state, or the bardo, as it sometimes is called, the Tibetan term for it. In that intermediate state, you go in a reverse process. All these other levels of awareness are resumed. And even in that intermediate state, you have some sensory consciousnesses. You have a different type of being, body during that state as an intermediate state being, a very subtle body that can move very quickly here and there. Essentially, for most beings, the intermediate state is a period of time when you're seeking your new rebirth. You're actively engaging in how do I find my next parents? Where is my next existence going to be? It's already karmically determined because, as I mentioned in this course, the mind that you have at death greatly determines what type of rebirth you're going to get, as well as what you've done with that life. If you've only created negative seeds, negative potential karma to have a bad rebirth, well, then that's what you're going to end up in. If you've engaged in a lot of virtue, well, then that's going to be what you draw from primarily. But when you have the mind of death in a very virtuous state, it complements that and could perhaps even overcome some of the negative karma that we have and cause something else to move forward. That already takes you into the intermediate state, and you are searching for your next existence, searching to be embodied. When you finally find that those beings that you have some karmic connection with, that you can then, happily go into your next life, then if it's a human rebirth, for example, your consciousness unites with the fertilized egg in the womb of your mother. And then that will be the continuity of your next rebirth. That's considered the moment of rebirth, is when you actually have the consciousness entering into the new physical form that you're going to have. There are some beings who have formless states, but we won't go into that for the moment. But essentially, the consciousness has this kind of ability then to manifest within that new existence once more with whatever consciousness that existence dictates, a human awareness, an animal awareness, whatever the case might be. But the thread of awareness is through all of this. As I said, the clear light mind continues as the core of experience that's underneath the surface of all of our conscious moments. So that's in a nutshell. I mean, I didn't want to go into deep teachings about it, but what is happening at death is once more an unfolding of all these grosser, a shedding of all these grosser levels of awareness, and then the subtler ones manifest. And then we, one by one, white appearance, red increase, black near attainment, we shed those. And then we end up in this subtlemost mind. As I said, can be a very powerful platform for spiritual practice, but we have to be well trained to use it in that way, because otherwise we're just going to lose the plot in the process of all these other things unfolding through the death process. But having some awareness, I found it kind of interesting. There was a little video that many, many years ago on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Some of it was filmed in the Bay Area because a teacher that I had for one course I took, Dale Borglum, I think is his name, he was sitting by the bedside of someone in a hospice situation and asking them if they wanted to know what Tibetan Buddhism says about what happens at death. And if you're going to share this information with somebody who's dying, it's good to ask permission, not just kind of blurt out something, because some people may find it disconcerting. I think it's actually quite interesting and could be really useful for somebody who is heading towards death. And this person was quite anxious to hear that. So it gives some information about at least what Tibetan Buddhism says occurs at the time of death. And maybe even if you have that curiosity after this and are more curious about death rather than frightened of death, that could be useful. But this is how it is set out. And again, there's uh, the Buddha gave these teachings in what are called the tantras, that are summarized again, the teachings on death in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So what the Dalai Lama then says is, if you are able to be mindful at death, recognizing the signs of the stages of dissolution, maintaining introspection enough to strive at whatever level of virtue you know, your practice will be very powerful. At the very least, it will positively affect your next life. So once more, we talk about this whole course is about preparing for the inevitable. How do we actually make sure that when death comes, we are as prepared as possible? And we've talked about this in a number of ways in this weekend. Well, one of them is to understand that if we practice meditating on this process unfolding, perhaps at our death we'll be more aware of what's going on. We can hold more virtuous thoughts throughout that process. Once more, in answer to Nick's question yesterday, if we're familiar with those, if we're familiar with bodhicitta, compassion, loving kindness, then we can bring those to the forefront of our mind. And as His Holiness says, at least have a positive effect on what happens afterwards. That our consciousness will go on to another existence. Spirit, whatever we want to call that, isn't going to die. We're sort of deathless in that way, but death still happens in the terms of shedding everything that is involved in this particular existence, and then another existence arising. That's really quite fascinating. I mean, once more, I was talking about, I think I talked about this the other day, about how the teachings on karma were really quite revolutionary for me, at least. I don't, maybe I didn't talk about that. I don't remember. I think it was in another teaching on this tour. When I first got teachings on karma, it was just really quite a relief because I felt like it explained why there's so much like injustice and differences in people's experiences and what have you. I mean, if we understand that there are forces behind this that we are the creators of, well, this is quite liberating, I think. And hearing about rebirth was also really quite refreshing for me. In the West, we don't grow up with this concept quite so much. I was actually shocked when my grandmother at the age of like 82 or something asked me if I, what about reincarnation? You believe in that? I was like, Grandma, where'd you get that from? but, it's not as widely accepted in the West, but in Eastern cultures, it's been very much a part of how you grow up, with some understanding of, that there's something after this life and that you need to be sort of focused on that as well as this life, some spiritual dimension in that regard. But I found it really quite refreshing to have this understanding and it taught in a very clear way as to how this whole process unfolds. I think I mentioned, yeah, the first book that I read in terms of, Tibetan Buddhism was Sogyal Rinpoche's Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And he describes in there, the process that you go through and everything. It's really, again, for me, it was quite refreshing. So I'm introducing it here as part of this course within the context of helping you to have some understanding of at least what it's said in this tradition occurs at death. I mentioned the other day that we have that people in our world that say nobody knows what happens when you die. Well, the Buddha would differ and say, well, this is actually what is occurring. Again, doesn't have a specific knowledge of what happens to you in terms of, from there and where you go to and whatever, but that's part of the process. So if we are attentive to the death process itself, as well as what we do with this life, then maybe when death comes, again, we won't be so filled with fear and anxiety. We can actually die much more peacefully. And as I said, maybe even be a little bit curious and try to bring a more virtuous state of mind to that process. So may have one more slide. Let me check. But really, I don't want to share too much more about it because it's a huge teaching. Yeah, that was it. Um, Anyone have anything they want to ask about that or share about that? Those teachings on the death process. I'll once more mention that His Holiness's book is excellent, and it actually gives a whole lot of information about Tantra that is a little, I don't know, maybe too much at times, but if you don't have to read all the parts about Tantra if you don't want to. But it's really quite informative, and it goes through the death awareness meditation as well, that book. It's a really nice book. We use that book generally for the death and rebirth module of Discovering Buddhism. At least that's the one I use. I think probably what Venerable Angie's using when she's teaching it here at Ocean of Compassion. So, all right. No questions. All right, then let's carry on. Oh, I'm getting some applause. Okay. Unless you have a question. Do you have a question, Virginia? No? Okay, Nick is asking if I could say the name of the book again. It's called Mind of Clear Light. Mind of Clear Light. Again, Virginia, do you have a question? Oh, Ginger. I'm sorry. Yes, please,
Yeah.
Ginger. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Good to see you again.
Okay. Um, my mother um, also passed away this year,
Oh, I'm sorry.
and on August 19th, she waited till her birthday. She was in a
Mm,
comatose state, kind of. And I do believe in this, like leaving the body alone for 3 days after
hmm
Western death. But thank goodness she died at like 5 in the morning, and I could be with her those 3 days when she was kind of like comatose. But and so there, when no one was up yet, I was able to hold her for an hour after she passed
mm,
until somebody came in the room, and then yeah, so that was
mm,
very special. I'm very glad I had that much of an opportunity, and I was saying prayers to her and everything. But
mm,
yeah, I guess I should have on myself, but I should have gotten together some more things. I don't know. Anyway, it was good. It was good for me. I hope she
mm.
passed peacefully. I don't
Yeah,
know. Can't tell.
right.
So I just wanted to put that in there. I hope my kids will let me be alone for 3 days and
hmm
not have to
Yeah,
whisk me away somewhere. Because
yeah.
so I guess maybe my question is, if you are hurried along after your Western medical time of death,
hmm
what do you go through this in the funeral home maybe, laying around? I mean,
hmm
or does
Yeah, yeah,
embalming take away any chance at that? What is your
yeah.
understanding?
Sure, sure, Ginger. No, and again, I'm sorry about your mother's passing, but it's good that you were able to be with the body and leave it undisturbed for 3 days. Yeah, that's usually a part of this teaching as well as when death does happen clinically. They say that it's ideal to leave the body undisturbed for up to 3 days. It might happen sooner than that. And if it's some great meditator, perhaps, and great practitioner, it might take longer than that. But during that period of time is when the mind is able to still abide in that state of clear light. And again, for most beings, they probably don't abide there for very long. They exit the body. And why they say don't move it or, have real strong, sensations around the body is because you might draw the consciousness out prematurely. And they say that Again, these things get a little esoteric, but what they say is generally if you're going to move the body, if you're going to have some disturbance of the body, that it's good to kind of either tap really hard on the crown of the head or pull the hair if there is hair there. Some people don't have hair there, but pull the hair so that you kind of force the consciousness to move through the top of the body. Said if you move through the top of the body, you might be influencing, again, a more favorable rebirth. Whereas if it leaves through the lower part of the body, it's an unfavorable rebirth. These get to be a little, I don't want to quite call them superstition, but I think the most important thing is if you can leave it undisturbed, even in a funeral home. Most funeral homes are quite fine with this, is my experience, is that if you say, well, we can't keep the body in the hospital or the hospice where location where the person died, clinically died, then at least move it into some space where the body can remain undisturbed. Best not to start things like any embalming or any of that because that's going to be disturbing to the body. Rather, allow it to rest undisturbed for up to 3 days. Now, the signs that the consciousness has already left, one of the things I encourage people to do if you are there at the time of death or shortly after is to feel right in the heart center here. Your heart chakra is kind of, about this where the sternum is, right in that area. And you want to feel that area to get an idea of how warm it is at the time of death. They say that the heat of the body will disappear from that area when the consciousness has left. It might be very subtle, and you might have, that's why I encourage at least one person who can be around for some time to feel that point, to get an idea of what the warmth is there. And if we get an idea of what the warmth is there after death, then we'll have an idea of when the warmth has gone because otherwise, I think if you just feel it, it might always feel a little bit cold. But the idea is there will be a change in that. And I notice this with some of the people I've attended to at death is that that will be one sign that can occur frequently. They say another sign is that um, there can be, if you have been around the body quite a bit, the person quite a bit, that you might even sense that there's a change, that the consciousness has left. That can be very subtle, but that may be noticeable to somebody who's quite familiar with them. But then they also say that there is this whole inner process that's going on, which I didn't go into because it's really quite complex and His Holiness goes into it. But they say that often a drop of blood might appear at the tip of the nostrils. And this actually, I did see this with some people, and that is a sign. Even with animals, they say, mammals in particular, like a dog, that can happen to show that the consciousness has left the body. And that drop of blood that's at the tip of the nose will be indicative that the process has completed. Because what's happening in your body with the mind of clear light manifesting is these subtle um, drops and things that are going to the heart center. And then when that is released, when the consciousness leaves, then that drop ascends and comes out the nose. So there are these various signs. Sometimes if you have people who are great meditators again, and they've died in the meditation posture. My teacher in Italy, I think he died this way, where he got up into meditation posture, and that's how he took his last breath. Then what will happen sometimes is there's a slumping of the body when the consciousness is left. While the consciousness is there, the body is somewhat more upright. But then when the consciousness leaves, it will fall somewhat. So there's a number of signs that you can pay attention to. So back to what you said, Ginger, the idea is that as much as possible, even when before, if you're going to have the body moved from like where the death took place clinically to some place where the body's going to be stored, as much as possible, try to handle the body as gently as you can. If people are doing this, it'll be people who, from the funeral home or whatever, are taking the body on a gurney out to the hearse to take it to the funeral home or what have you. Just be mindful of that. And again, they do, I think in America, at least in most parts of America, certainly in California, you get a lot of people who are Buddhists who request this. So it's becoming they know and they at least have some information, or if you say that to them, then they should honor that. And so you should be giving that information to them as they're handling the body and what have you. So I think that's maybe most of what you asked and giving some more instruction. Ken Lama Zopa Rinpoche in the book How to Enjoy Death. I think it was republished. That one I'm not sure is even, it's probably available, but what was it republished at? Can you find out, Casey? Maybe I should put together a little book list for this course as well, but it was republished as something like How to Die Peacefully or something. No, that's the old one. Do you have the newer one that's like anyway, I'll make sure that I'll add a slide at the end of the slides that I send to you that will have a little short book list of the ones that I've cited that, to make sure that you can obtain those. Um, was that everything, Ginger, in terms of addressing that? Okay. Yeah, Virginia, did you have a question? Or anyone else online or here in the Gompa? Yeah, okay. So again, I hope that presenting that information is useful to you, at least give you some idea. And if you're really curious about it, once more, there are resources where you can read a lot more. There is the chat box is, yeah, there's the same one about the book. Okay, so let's go on. I actually, since yesterday, because I worked on some of these slides yesterday afternoon, the work of a teacher, I told Casey, she was a teacher as well, is either teaching or preparing to teach. That's what you do with your day. So I switched the last two topics, and I think it makes more sense this way, because the last one, the four tasks of living and dying, I think is a nice way to end our time together. I want to talk a little bit about other preparations for death, and this is maybe heading into even more practical considerations. I'm sure Ginger, you found in dealing with your mother's passing this year, my mother's passing. It's been a strange year. I've had like five or six people who are friends of mine who've all lost their mother. One lost their father as well. But anyway, we're all, as you get older, that's what starts happening if it hasn't already happened, is that people tend to lose their parents. So these are also things to keep in mind in regard to working with those that you love and helping them to prepare for the reality of death. Because I think because death is such a taboo subject in our culture, that we often don't think about preparing even practically for it in terms of the things I'm going to be presenting, going through in a somewhat brief way. But there's a lot of tools now that we have, and certainly things out on the internet that can be used to express exactly what you want in terms of your death. Now, whether it happens that way, once more, we don't know when our death's going to come or how it's going to happen. Your death may be very sudden through an accident or something, and all of what you did in preparing for a more gradual death won't happen. But for many of us, if we have a gradual death, well, then it's important that we express what we want in regard to that, how we see that. We were even talking about the issue, I think that was yesterday. We were talking about uh, what they call sort of assisted suicide, medically assisted suicide, but I don't really like this term because it's a strange way to look at it, but nonetheless, I suppose Buddhism even looks at it to some degree as suicide. But when we get to that time of our life and we are making a decision about whether we want to use means to end our life because of what we're going through, that's important to be communicated as well. Now, in Buddhism, they say it's probably not the best thing to do because perhaps we're cutting this life premature and we can do some important things in that time we have left, regardless of what our condition might be. But if that's going to be put on somebody else, then I think that becomes really challenging. Now, again, medically assisted end of life care, and doing that in New Mexico, at least, you have to be able to take the medicine yourself. So it's never something that someone does to you. But if you are going to be in a situation where you can't make decisions for yourself, it's important to let people know what you wish. So let me share a little bit about this. Most of this comes down to what we call advanced care directives. The only reason why I'm, oh, there it is. No, 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 no. It's check. Yeah, it is. But check at Wisdom Pubs, and they've got um, the book about death. It's got a slightly different title, but it's the same essential book. That one was the PDF of it that came out earlier, and then I don't know. That's all right. No, no, no. So advanced care planning, and again, why I'm putting this out there is just as I said, because a lot of us don't do this. And you might think, oh, I'm too young to think about death, or I don't have to worry about it. We all have to take this step because it's a big relief to our loved ones to have these things in place. Trust me, from my experience. First, having an advance directive that includes a living will. A living will is one that does speak to these sorts of medical needs and issues that you want addressed, that you want to make sure that your wishes are communicated. and a healthcare proxy for designating a healthcare agent for decisions and communicating choices on life support treatment, pain medication, organ donation, and other logistics. You know, you should discuss with this healthcare proxy, and usually they have two. They usually have an alternate as well as the one that you are designating as the main one. And it's good to have some communication with them about what you wish so that you actually are, kind of putting that out there so that they aren't guessing, oh, well, I think, Don said something about this, but I'm not sure. Maybe he wanted that, maybe he didn't. So you want to have it very clearly communicated. And in fact, I'm even going to make available to you a document, I'll put it on screen shortly, that has some guidance that we can give people in terms of of our spiritual care, or that they might communicate in terms of their spiritual care. But mainly this one is around what is going to happen medically. What sorts of interventions do you want? Do you want, if you do end up in more or less a vegetative state where you no longer have the ability to make decisions for yourself, what sorts of life-sustaining treatments do you want administered? If we don't communicate those things, then again, we're putting that burden on another person who it shouldn't necessarily be their decision. That should be something we determine, and that we then give them very clear instruction. So these documents are a way to provide that, to say, this is exactly my advance directive about how I want things managed through my death. Might not be able to guess everything that could happen, but it'll be clear enough in regard to the main points that whoever we are choosing as our proxy or healthcare, durable power of attorney for healthcare, that they know what they need to do. And my brother was the one chosen for this for my mother. And, she had some advance directive. Unfortunately, she didn't have, what's the one called when you don't want medical intervention, when you, like the emergency type stuff. DNR, thank you. Do not resuscitate. She didn't have one of those in place. So unfortunately, when my sister found her collapsed on the bathroom floor, she had to call the EMTs in and what have you. But nonetheless, um, it's important that we communicate that as much as possible to our family members or whoever we think might be there. I'm going to introduce you to some of these. You may have heard of some of these before. There are a selection of free resources for advanced directives. There's the advanced directive forms by state that are available through AARP. You go there and you can put a search in for that, and it will give you, for California, if that's where you live, you click on it and it gives you exactly what is needed in a form that you can use. You don't have to go to a lawyer for these. You might need, in each certain states, you might need signatures that indicate that you have signed it in their presence, witnesses. The conversation project is a wonderful one to get the conversation started, to be around that and to use the tools in that to determine what it is that you want. That's sometimes a nice one to do in conjunction with filling out the actual form. The Five Wishes is also a really nice document. This is the one I've used in the past and I always introduce people to, is it sets out through five different things, who your advanced care person is, that is going to be there as your proxy, what sorts of wishes you have in regard to your physical care, and even to some dimension, I think the fifth one is more about spiritual care or other things that you want to communicate around what happens at the time of death and so on. So things like, I want my body to be undisturbed for 3 days, to be left undisturbed for 3 days. That can be communicated. One thing I might mention while we're on that subject, I forgot to mention this with regard to the body. If you're in a place where, in almost any place, is going to be somewhat subject to warmer temperatures, unless you can have the body somewhere where it stays cool, it's good to use dry ice to keep the body from any sort of decay. Sometimes they do say that when the decay of the body starts, that the consciousness has left. But nonetheless, I think for everyone's sake, it's best if you can get some dry ice from local grocery stores and just pack it underneath the body. That's a good way to assure that that is kind of dealt with. But those sorts of things can all be communicated, again, in any sort of advance directive. In terms of the last one there, I think there's one more that I found out there and doing my research for this for a recent course. It's called Prepare for Your Care. And it's a very similar process of kind of looking at the whole thing. But there's lots of information at these websites around what is available and what decisions, but it's up to you to, again, fill it out and express what your wishes are. And then that way, people have access to that. Now, when you do that, of course, don't just leave it filed away in a drawer somewhere. Have it give a copy to the people who are your advanced care people, who are going to be your proxies. Have one maybe even somewhere in your house where people will know if something happens to you, that they can then find it very easily. Make sure that it's not something that's hidden away or tucked into a safety deposit box in a bank or something where they're not going to, locate it. But these are things I found out there that are in this vein that I think can be really, really useful. And you might have a conversation with your loved ones about these decisions too. They don't have to be entirely yours, but they should be something you're comfortable with. I might mention while we're on the subject of making plans for death that cremation and burial options are, I think, good to look at. Green burial is getting to be a big thing because of course, some consciousness around the environment. A lot of funeral homes now do green burial. And by green burial, we mean the least destructive in terms of chemicals and things that go into the ground. If you are cremated, of course, cremation will entail using fuel to cremate your body, though I did hear from a friend that they can do something now that's called what, water cremation or something, where they use high jet force water or something to do that. I don't know. It sounds kind of strange to me. But know that there are those options, but certainly burial itself, where the body is um, embalmed and where you're in a casket with all of this metal and stuff you're putting into the ground. I mean, those are not really the best thing for the environment, but I know some people, my mother wanted that choice, so we honored it and what have you. But green burial options are getting to be much more frequent. Yeah, Ginger, you had your hand up. I'm sorry, I didn't see it, perhaps. Okay. We'll check with Virginia after Ginger. Yes, Ginger, you can unmute. Yeah.
Now, Virginia is my laptop, so I can see everybody.
Uh, oh, I see. Okay.
I Yeah. So, but okay, I'm having trouble locating my hands. I finally found it. Okay, there.
Okay, great.
Um, I didn't ask about what if we want to donate our organs? Is that a good Buddhist thing to do, or is it better the
Yeah.
body stay intact?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. Maybe for this, I can make available. I think I'd scan this article, and there's an article that was in Tricycle magazine, the Buddhist magazine, that talks about this because you can donate certain things before your last breath. Once your last breath takes place, though, and the body begins some process of change, some of your organs are not donatable, and so organ harvesting, like my dear friend Rowena, who was the director of our center in Santa Fe for 12 years, her son passed away in an automobile accident, but he was alive on machines while all of this was right after the accident, and she had to make the painful decision of disconnecting him from that, but he had organs harvested before that. Now, what they say is that that will probably be an interruption to the process of the consciousness. So of course, if the consciousness it hasn't gone through the entire process because it's still on the machines and everything, it's hard to say what the effect of that is going to be. It's really kind of a mystery because no one's there to kind of tell us, well, what's going on with the consciousness of a being when they are still being kept alive through these artificial life support and organs are being harvested. So this article goes into like things you can donate after the last breath has occurred and even up to 3 days after, where if we do have the body rest for 3 days, you might still be able to have some things that you are donating. Your body can certainly still be donated to science for research. That's one way of using your body in at least some beneficial way. But some of the organ harvesting that happens of like kidneys and vital organs and what have you will be something that needs to be done before your last breath. And so that is something to think about in terms of whether you want that happening and potentially mucking around with that process that's happening and the potential that you might have of being somewhat aware or conscious during all of that. Um, I mean, we don't know what's going on for people who are in these vegetative states, right? We don't know to what degree they are having a conscious awareness. Um, make a determination from our observation outside, but then maybe even brain waves or what's going on in terms of the physical side of it, but whether the consciousness is still there, it would seem that it is. So those are tricky things. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama, on the alternate side, he said that still, if you have the intention of giving your organs through you're indicating that on your driver's license or whatever, and you really want your organs to go to someone who will benefit and have a life that is more complete and full, and maybe even have their life because you've donated an organ to them, well, that's an incredible act of generosity. And it's kind of a nice way to go out in a sense, to actually make your body be a benefit to other beings. So we can look at it that perspective. I would guess that a lot of us aren't such practitioners that we're going to have, you know, such a focused mind during this whole process that it's going to become a problem. But if that makes you a little nervous about organ harvesting before your last breath, then you might need to make that stipulation that you're fine with particular organs being donated, but nothing else that would be disruptive. So I'll send that article out. I think it's called like Living Bodies, Dying Bodies, or something. I don't remember the name of the article. It was some years ago, and I think most of the information in it is somewhat valid still, though it might require some research on the internet as well, or talking to folks to see um, whether that is still the case. But that's my understanding. I don't know if anyone else can share any information about that. Maybe you've dealt with that with loved ones wanting organs to be harvested. But anyway, I hope that helped a bit, Ginger. Um, it really is a very personal decision, though, and something that you need to look at and say, well, there is great benefit, obviously. I mean, we see it when you have people on a list waiting for a good kidney. And if you have two good kidneys, you might be able to help two people. And what a wonderful thing to do in your last hours, days. Okay. Let's go on to kind of conclude this with, I think I got one more topic to talk about after cremation and burial options. I just throw that on there without a whole lot of, like, I'm not going to steer you here or steer you there, just information as that you can look into. It's worth kind of spending some time seeing what might be possible for you. Uh, Spiritual support at the time of death. Venerable Dreame, she was a nun. She's not ordained right now because she went up to Washington State to care for her mother. She was a nun that was at the Land of Medicine Buddha right down the way in SoCal near Santa Cruz. And she put together what's called a Steps at the Time of Death document that is really quite specific to our tradition, but I've got it in a Word format so that you can alter it as you wish or put together your own document. This too, I will make sure gets sent out by Bay to everyone. It's again where you just simply put your name and this is something once more that you would give to if you're a practitioner in this tradition, or even if you fill it out with other information from another tradition, you give that to once more the people who might be more involved in your care at that time. It's technically not a durable power of attorney for medical care because this isn't medical care. This is spiritual care. So this is something you should communicate in your advance directive, like the 5 wishes, or have it attached to it so that people are really clear about what you want done. So as I am dying, for example, I mean, the two that are highlighted there are probably pretty standard, for people to stay calm and centered in your presence, to avoid nonsensical or upsetting conversation around me. So I can have a peaceful death without getting distracted by all this going on. The ones that are under that are things that we might choose from, and you can put a tick next to them if you want, or you can add, things if you want, or change them. Again, it's a Word document, so you can do whatever you want. Um, but these are things that Lama Zopa often recommends, to have recitations of particular mantras like Medicine Buddha, to have pictures around us that inspire us, not pictures of our relatives and friends or dogs or whatever, but pictures of holy beings that give us some spiritual dimension to what we're thinking about and looking at. And then different other things. There's about the Tong Len practice, which I'm not going to talk about, and all these other things. There's lots of information here, but you can look into this, change it as you wish, and then that's as you're dying. After your last breath, this is that particular time when it's before the body has been moved. So stay calm and quiet in the presence of my body. Leave my body untouched as long as possible. We could say for 3 days, for at least 3 days. Touch the crown of the head before any place else. This is once more because that's where the consciousness ideally we'd want it to leave before moving the body. Pull hard on the hair at the crown or tap the crown of my head. Notify spiritual master, friend, spiritual friends who are, whoever it is that you want notified. You can add more lines for that. Again, you can modify this as you wish. Uh, then there's speak into my ear, various things. Even though your ear consciousness might be somewhat diminished, you still might be able to hear. Actually, Rinpoche would recommend yelling into the ear, but maybe that seems a little strange after somebody's last breath to yell into their ear. But again, there's all these other mantras, practices. I might point out that at the top of that document was two links to get to a number of practices. You can just click on those, should be able to click on those, maybe with like control and enter, and you should be able to go. Actually, we can do that with one of these, I think. Is it not going there? Maybe it's going there and I can't tell. Yeah, I think it's coming up on my Firefox. Can you see that? Did it go to Fire? No, I'm gonna have to go out. Let me stop my share and I'll pull it up. That way you can at least know where this is at. So I'll screen share my Firefox. This is what the page looks like, the one that I clicked on. It's called there at the bottom, Death and Dying Practices and Resources. Wonderful part of the FPMT. This is the book, How to Face Death Without Fear, a handbook by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Thanks, Casey. So if you click on that, it goes to where you can buy this is the ebook of it, but you can buy the hardcover edition if you wish that. So again, there's lots of resources out here, lots of practices and things. I don't have time to go into all of this, but you can have some fun kind of going through all this and picking out certain things that you feel you would like to have done or not done or whatever. Then we have one more part of this document, which is after my death. And that's important in Buddhist terms because, again, our consciousness is going on to the intermediate state, is going on to another existence. And so we want to perhaps have some practices done. So we might tell people to arrange for certain prayers or what we call pujas, offering ceremonies to be performed for me by, for example, the monks at Kopan Monastery or the nuns at Kopan Monastery or whatever. And there are links to some of that. There is a listing of the people who have died who are affiliated with our organization in some way, relatives of our members or what have you, called Prayers for the Dead. So if you go to fpmt.org PFD/PFD, Prayers for the Dead, then people in the organization make prayers for them. Our prayers are said to be somewhat helpful in the transition into another life. We might have people make donations in our name and so on. I don't need to go through all of these necessarily. I just wanted to introduce you to that document. So you can modify that document again as you wish, but it can be stapled to your 5 wishes or other documents that are about your advanced directive, giving those who are involved in your spiritual care, especially, some guidance about what you want done. Because otherwise, people are going to do what they naturally do. You know, they might come in and they're sitting at your bedside talking on the phone to somebody about, something that's going on next week or something. And do you really want that going on while you're moving through the death process? Um, I just think it's important that we spell that all out. Any questions or comments on these other preparations? I'm sure there's other things I could talk about from my mother's passing. It's really useful if you have like a lot of things financially dealt with too, of course. I don't want to go too much into that, but we did have some issues around ways that my mother had some accounts that weren't as accessible then, and you have to go through more estate stuff and all of this probate. And then we have other things that were really quite easy to deal with. So you might look into all of that with a loved one and look at your own financial situation and make sure people can access things upon your last breath because we might die in an accident and then that person's sitting there and they don't know how to get into any of your accounts or do any of your stuff. Even having like passwords. I know it's don't want to necessarily have your passwords floating around somewhere, but to give them at least to some person who is going to be able to access things. Because it was so helpful because I could access so much of my mom's stuff and deal with her bills and things that needed to be managed and what have you. So, because I was the executor of her estate. And so I appreciated all of that, definitely. That's enough on that. Let's go to, is there a comment or question? Anyone? Okay. Let's go to the final topic for our little time together here. This is something that I think is, a really nice presentation. I first came across Christine Longacre's book. It's called The Facing Death and Finding Hope, A Guide to the Emotional and Spiritual Care of the Dying. She's was a student of Sogyal Rinpoche's, and so she was actually on the retreat I took in 1993 with him and some 500 other people. And it's a really nice book. She was a hospice worker, very involved in hospice, and she lost her husband at the age of 24 to a rare form of leukemia. So she had her own experiences around death and dying and speaks from that experience as well as being a caregiver in hospice. Understanding and fully undertaking what she called the four tasks of living and dying enables us to face ourselves and understand how and why we are choosing to live, even in the midst of our deepest pain. So it's kind of living and dying, these two together. We are preparing for dying, but we're also embracing life while we have it. The four tasks offer us the opportunity to let go of past habits and commit to a positive direction for our lives, enabling us to evolve into more genuine and compassionate human beings. And I think that they're all contribute in some regard to that result. Life is already a path, a journey toward the ultimate destination of death. We can commit to making that journey a spiritual one, whether we call it developing a good heart, becoming a genuine human being, or realizing our wisdom nature and attaining liberation. Again, different definitions people would give to what they call their spiritual journey. They're all in the same category, though, depending upon our own individual situation. We have the potential to discover a playful spaciousness, generosity, and humor to touch others' hearts with kindness, and thereby bring more goodness into this world. And when we finally experience our own death, we will know without a doubt that we have done something useful with our lives. So, this is maybe part of this, a continuation of what we already have talked about a bit today. What does it mean to live our lives fully or to have purpose to our lives, what have you? These are things that we're going to be exploring as part of these four. The first task, and these are just again, I'm just putting the four bullet points, and I got a few quotes from Christine Longacre on this. But the first task is understanding and responding to suffering. Now, Buddhism has a particular view of that, and I've already talked about this a little bit. And when I introduced this subject on Friday night, I said that Buddhism sees suffering as an undeniable part of life. That there is going to be, and as we saw with the five remembrances, there's going to be aging, there's going to be illness, there's going to be death. We're going to be separated from those that we love, loss, grief, lamentation. All of this is part of the big picture that we deal with in Buddhism. But once more, the Buddha didn't just say, guess what? That's what life is, and too bad. Sorry. The Buddha said there's a way out of that. There's a way of attaining a cessation of samsara, of going from life to life and attaining a true liberation. All right. So that is possible through practicing the Buddha's teachings. So suffering is in the context of that. And suffering, even in the Mahayana tradition, we even use suffering often as a focal point for how we can develop our greatest skills and abilities by working with our suffering, having an understanding of it, even an embracing of it, and recognizing that it has incredible lessons for us. It's like in the meditation I led this morning before the class, our enemies are sometimes called our greatest teachers. The people who push our buttons are the ones that can help us develop to the greatest degree because we can develop qualities around patience and tolerance and loving kindness and compassion to greater degrees when we work with people that are in that category. The same goes for all the problems and difficulties that we have in life. If we accept them and invite them into our lives and see what they have to teach us, then we can actually grow from them. Rather than them becoming obstacles to our spiritual development, they become a force to help us to move forward, amazingly. In Tibetan Buddhism, this is what we often call, I mentioned this before, lojong, mind training. And the idea is that when we see our own suffering or the suffering of others, we're reminded of the things we need to practice, such as renunciation, those samvega and pasada, turning away from the world of crazy activities, the eight worldly affairs and what have you, and actually embracing deeper spiritual goals. So the Buddhist way of working with this first task is to really say, how are we seeing suffering? How are we understanding suffering? What is the role of suffering in our lives and in our spiritual life? I know a lot of people, I mean, my mother, she had always had this view around suffering that I guess comes out of a Judeo-Christian tradition of like, if they do think that God is pulling the strings and kind of causing them in some way to have that, they say, well, God only gives me as much as I can handle. Kind of like if this is a suffering that I've been encouraged to, or not necessarily encouraged, I've been forced to bear, forced to deal with. This is coming into my life, not of my own choosing, but it's God giving me this. Well, then God's giving me what he knows I can deal with, what I can handle. And that's a very courageous thought then, then you feel like you've got what you need because God wouldn't give it to you if you didn't have what you need. In Buddhism, we don't hold it that way. It's karma giving us the lessons we need to learn. It's all of this being a product of our own past actions, but it still has that perspective of something like, and this is something we can actually learn from and deal with. We can actually develop more skills and abilities on the basis of that. But whatever way we have of framing suffering is a useful task for ourselves in terms of looking at our own having to face death, illness, aging, and so on, but also even with others. So if you're tending to someone who is approaching death, what have you, it might be useful to have a conversation about how do you see your death and your suffering? Well, how do you understand that? And it's just from the point of view, you can say it, I'm just wanting to be respectful of that and attentive to that so I can support you in how you are working with that. And some people may say, well, I haven't really thought about it, let me get back to you. Or they might say, I don't really want to think about it. Maybe I don't want to think about my suffering. It's a shame because once more, that could be an opening for people to work with what's going on with them in a way that could be quite liberating, quite giving them new dimensions and ways of looking at it. Buddhism has its own way of observing suffering. So let me share a little bit about what she says. But understanding and responding to suffering is this first task. She says, we can see how important it is that we develop a framework of understanding that enables us to accept the whole of life with all of its joys and sorrows, accomplishments and disappointments, not leave anything out. The Buddhist teachings reveal that suffering is universal, an inevitable and natural part of being alive, and shows how, if we use them wisely, our deepest experiences of pain or loss can reveal an essential next step along our spiritual path. It can really help us to open to how we need to grow, to see, the things that we need to work on. We cannot control the hand that life deals us, right? Because that karma is going to ripen. It's going to come into our lives. And in the Buddhist terms, there's this idea of the first arrow. There are two arrows. The first arrow is what life deals us through our own karmic imprints that have ripened into that experience. All we can do is decide whether we're going to do the second arrow or not, and decide how we will play the hand we've got. This two arrows thing is that often we have an additional layer of pain that we inflict on ourselves because we don't deal with the first arrow so well. We have to face the reality of death. We have to face illness, aging, as we saw in the remembrances. But what do we do with that? How do we respond to that? We don't have to torture ourselves on that. We don't have to get consumed with, fear and anxiety around death. We can actually be quite spacious about it. So, thus, she says, we can use the experience of suffering as opportunities for focusing the energies of our heart and mind in new ways, strengthening our positive qualities, changing a destructive habit, healing our unfinished business, or deepening our trust in our spiritual path. The challenge is to find a way to grow or give ourselves a positive direction in the midst of our suffering, rather than agonizing about what we are losing. So again, I think those are really wonderful words that elucidate a bit more perhaps what we mean by that first task. It's just, embracing what's going on as much as we can so that we use that as a learning opportunity and respond appropriately. This is the second one is what I was referring to a little bit earlier today about, making a connection. This was in a response to Russ's question about contrition or confession, making a connection, healing relationships, and letting go. This is an important thing that we will be there certainly at our death if it comes in a gradual way, but we should be doing this throughout our lives. Once more, this 5 tasks of both living and dying. This is what she says about this. The purpose of this task, making a connection, healing relationships, and letting go, is to chart the journey of death and offer tools for communicating and healing relationships, tools that will enable you to navigate your present or future life situations with greater awareness, compassion, and skill. So again, when we talk about making connections with others, helping to heal relationships, I pointed out earlier that a lot of this has to do with, well, where we really feel that we've had some issues that are unresolved that we really should tend to. And I don't want to wait until my deathbed to tend to those things. I should want to deal with them right now because I'm going to live a much better life if I feel a stronger connection to those that I love through having sought their forgiveness, through having apologized for the things that I've done to them, and having forgiven them for what they've done to me. So, all of that about healing relationships, at least putting it out there. You may be in a relationship or have a relationship from this life that is not something you want to restore. Maybe it was an abusive relationship that will probably be abusive if you renew it. That's okay. Again, you still can do this in terms of your own processing of that. I often teach on forgiveness. Jack Kornfield has a wonderful meditation on forgiveness and how to forgive ourselves, how to forgive others. We can do that on our cushion at least. If you can do it for the person who you offended or who has offended you, well, then that's a wonderful part of the healing process. But sometimes we also have people who've gone, right? Maybe you have a parent who was very abusive and they're out of your relationship now because they've died, they've gone on. Well, then you can't do that, right? You can't go to them and say, I forgive you for what you did out of your ignorance and delusion or whatever. So you do it on your cushion, you do it in your own mind, in your own heart, so that you're not holding on to that as you approach death. So this is what is all entailed in this whole one of like, how do we make deeper connections with others? How do we make sure that we use the time that we have to enhance our concern for others, our, compassion for them, our love for them? That's the essence of it. I don't need to probably spend more time than that on it because I think this one's fairly clear. How do we actually, make those connections with others? Um, Let go of things that, again, we need to let go of. Got a lot of baggage we carry around. Do we want to take that to the, next life? So the third task, preparing spiritually for death. Now, we touched on this a little bit already in regard to what Buddhism would say, but spiritually is a huge context. Got a lot of things that would fit into that category. So we need to embrace what are the things that are going to help us to feel like we're adequately prepared in terms of our spirit, our being, when we get to the point of death, or help others to do the same. So again, she uses that term bardo here to refer to dying. Sometimes they use that like each of these, the bardo of living, the bardo of dying, the bardo of the intermediate state, the bardo of rebirth, whatever. But the idea is the secret to traversing this process of dying is recognizing that we are in a crucial transition and deciding on the outcome we want, thereby giving ourselves a direction through the seemingly dangerous upheavals of dying. Yet, this direction, our ultimate hope and highest spiritual potential, is the same hope we must nurture in our heart and mind throughout life. Again, they often say death is going to be another moment like the rest of your life, and essentially, in its essence, that's what it is. It's going to be different in terms of the end of this life, but you're going to live that moment in the same way that you've lived this life. I emphasized this previously. You have to engage in a spiritual practice now. We already saw the teachings that encourage us to do that. But what our hope is when we get to death and what that's going to be like and what comes after is going to be a product of what we've done throughout this life, not just your thoughts at that moment. Every religious tradition, she says, emphasizes that to prepare spiritually for death, it is vital that we establish right now a daily spiritual practice, a practice so deeply ingrained that it becomes part of our flesh and bones, our reflexive response to every situation in life, including our experiences of suffering. It's kind of interesting. When the earthquake happened in Nepal, Venerable Sarah Thresher, she's a nun in our tradition, she was over there and she posted on Facebook to the people, particularly who experienced the shaking of the earth and all of that. And of course, you guys are here in California where that happens sometimes. You know, what was your first thought? What was the first thought that you had when that happened? And it's a good sort of exercise to see how deeply ingrained our spiritual practice is. Was your thought maybe one of, in Buddhist terms, taking refuge? Or was your thought of, what the hell? Where am I? What's going to happen to me? You know, is it a fear? Is it whatever? I think we gain some appreciation for it in those moments where we go, or maybe you just have a near accident on the road. You're driving and a car just about clips you. What's your first thought? Is it yelling at the person and wanting to get angry, or is it something inside yourself that you can rely upon? That's a product of your own spiritual practice. Once more, I said that yesterday that again forgot to look up who it is that the Greek who this is attributable to. We don't rise to the level of our aspirations. We fall to the level of our training. So your training is your practice, your spiritual practice. If you want to be depending upon that at death, you have to practice it throughout this life. This is what essentially is being said in regard to this third task. having an awareness of death through what we've done this weekend should give you the impetus to say, if you don't already, what does my spiritual practice look like? How am I training my mind every day so it's ready when death comes? So that when everything starts shaking and all the buildings are crumbling or whatever, you know where your mind is going to be. Maybe you get your physical body, under a doorway or whatever they say, to avoid some of that, but you know where your mind is at. You know what you're doing in terms of if death were to come, what sorts of thoughts you're having. Did you look that up? Archilochus or Archilochus? Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'll have to remember that. I don't know how, but okay. Yeah. So let me continue with a few other things she says on this, because this is perhaps one of the most relevant of these four tasks, though obviously they're all four important. Whoops, I thought I had more on that. Oh, it's the last one I have more on. So maybe that's good enough. Let me check with people on that third one, kind of getting what we're saying here. And what does a spiritual practice look like? Again, that can be very individual. Some of us, of course, have been around Buddhism a long time and we've done a lot of tantric empowerments and we've gotten different commitments and our lamas have maybe told us certain things we should do. Remember, all of that is part of a spiritual practice, the recitations and the things that we do every day. But I still have to keep going back to, in Buddhism, the deepest spiritual practice is changing our minds. If we're going to get to our deathbed and want to be free of anger, if anger is something we see pretty common in our lives, that we're getting angry at the way people are driving and angry at the way people are voting and angry at the way people are talking to us at work and angry at this and angry at that, well, you have to start addressing that. Don't wait for your deathbed, because then you're going to probably have anger at something, at the way the hospice nurse is doing this or the way that your relatives are doing that. We have to calm our minds now. If we're going to rest upon that when we get to our death, it's only going to be facilitated by becoming familiar with it now. Remember that even this word meditation in Tibetan, we call this space that we're in here a gompa, a place of meditation. Gom. Gom is rooted in the idea of becoming familiar with something. It's kind of a nice way to approach our meditation. I'm going to sit in my room and become familiar with something, become familiar with a more focused mind, familiar with skills of mindfulness, concentration, and so on, become familiar with loving kindness, compassion. It's all about our minds becoming acquainted and familiar with something that is not its current nature. Our minds are not, absolutely focused and full of loving kindness for all beings at every moment. So we need practices to support that. So your meditation is a good part of that. All these other things that we do, recitations and tantric things that we do, are a complement to that. But the most important is, as we are off the cushion, what are our minds doing? Is it a byproduct of all of that, or is it still in some other zone? And if we're doing really effective work on the cushion in what we're doing every day, then it should change how we are in the world. But if you're finding there's a disconnect, how I am on my cushion and how I am off my cushion, then maybe you need to look at that. Maybe you need to say, well, what do I need to adjust here? How do I need to work with this so that I actually can be the person I want to be, regardless of where I am? So enough on that. Um, let's go on to the fourth one, the last of these four. This one seems somewhat related, but some people, maybe finding meaning is another task that we really can do in conjunction with our spiritual practice. And maybe it's somewhat the same, lines up somewhat nicely. But I think this can also be something that people who perhaps don't have a spiritual life might still be able to find something that is purposeful and meaningful with their lives. Christine Longacre says, we never face ourselves until death unequivocally faces us. If rather than running the other way, we gazed into the mirror of our death today, we might be motivated to find a purposeful direction for the rest of our life. We see what death is, what is the lesson we learn from death, that we need to be attentive to life, that we need to be attentive to how we are living our lives and whether we find some deeper purpose. It is interesting, with the one book by Louis Richman that I think I quoted the D.T. Suzuki line from earlier, he says in there that there's a study that shows that people live longer, elderly folks who feel like they have a purpose, a meaning. That if you just kind of free float, you finish your working career and retire, and then you just sort of free float without any real guiding purpose or meaning, it can be kind of disastrous. Again, it's not a given that if you don't have that, you're not going to live as long. But it seems that people do have a longer lifespan because of their engagement in something that feels purposeful and meaningful for them. So again, a lot of elderly folks might find great meaning in volunteering their time and doing things that contribute. We had a wonderful little program in Santa Fe with the public schools, where 'cause Santa Fe is getting to be a huge retirement community, where people who are older and retired can come and be like recess monitors and kind of be there interacting with the young kids and helping them if one of them falls, to make sure that their skin knee gets a bandage on it or whatever. But I mean, not with the older kids. I think recess for the older kids might be a little dangerous. But I think they have the older folks out there, doing this, and it keeps them kind of young, hanging around young kids, because sometimes they don't have young children in their lives and what have you. So again, purpose and meaning can be a bit, it's really what we make it. Where do we find purpose? Where do we feel like we're contributing? What is it that we feel we need to do with this life that contributes to having something to guide us from day to day? And for older folks, that sometimes can become an issue after retirement. Those who know their time is limited sometimes discover just how askew their priorities have been and consequently rearrange their time and activities and their spiritual commitment to reflect their true values. They actually use the time of dying as a final opportunity to face themselves honestly and to grow personally and spiritually. I mean, that's the real challenge that we've used our life with great meaning and purpose throughout it. And then when we get to our death, we can even have that perspective at death. Well, how do I actually grow from that experience? How do I actually, and because our consciousness goes on in Buddhism, all of that work will be well worth it. We must commit to a purpose in life greater than the fulfillment of our personal mundane desires. We've already touched on this as part of this course. These 8 worldly concerns that we can just become totally preoccupied with and find a way that we can give to life. That idea of generosity, giving, I mean, that could be a good part of finding purpose or meaning because it might be giving our time, giving our skills, giving our resources, what have you. She goes on to say, then we will know what the most important thing is for us. Then, although life may have its pleasures, changes, suffering, or pain, nothing will divert us from our primary purpose. As long as we stay focused on that, something bigger, something more lasting than just our everyday concerns and having what we want. Um, so maybe there's one more quote. I think I may have one more quote. I'm sorry, I took that off there and yeah. Another one? No, this is completing the task. Okay, we'll get to that in a moment. She goes on to say, painful circumstances and suffering will not cast us as victims of tragedy, but rather we understand them as part of our life's path, opportunities for transformation and growth. By choosing a creative response to every situation or difficulty we encounter, we define daily and hourly the meaning of our life. So meaning or purpose is something that, once more, we can have in a variety of ways. But there was with that a purpose-driven life by that one Christian minister. I think I can't remember his name either, but um, yeah. Anyway, the idea is that what are we here for? In Buddhist terms, it's pretty clear. We're here to serve other sentient beings by developing our own qualities, being attentive to them, trying to get out of our own stuff, follow the Buddhist teachings, and eventually attain, liberation and enlightenment, all these more lofty goals, as well as a good rebirth, all these things that we talk about. But every one of us might find there's other more immediate things that give us meaning and purpose. Attending to. For some of you, maybe family even. Maybe you have family members who are in a situation that requires your care and your ability to, give your time and resources to them. Or maybe it's caring for loved ones that are in the last stages of life. And that can be a very powerful way to practice as well, to be with others in that kind of unconditional presence. These 4 tasks are, I mean, it's hard to complete them completely, I suppose, to have that full completion. But this is what she says about completing them. Facing death is an especially profound opportunity to undertake the tasks of personal and spiritual growth. Yet we don't have to wait until the end of life to begin to face ourselves and grow. Something again, which I don't think I have to say again, because it's pretty clear from everything we've touched on. Each task of these 4 contains the seeds of all the others. Applying ourselves to beginning any one of them can bring us closer to the fundamental goodness of our nature. So once more, the forward understanding suffering and relating to it, responding to it in a healthier way, working on healing our relationships and um, that branch of it. The third one, which had to do with um, our spiritual path and applying that, and then the fourth one pertaining to finding meaning and purpose in life. We will reap the rewards the next time suffering or grief comes into our life, and without a doubt, by having begun to heal our relationship with life and prepared for our own death, we will know how to compassionately support others going through crises or facing death. This is one of the wonderful things, is that by working with these things ourselves, we become more adept and able to help others to face their issues. Um, we'll end with that. It's a nice little prayer that Lewis Richmond had put together. Any questions or comments on these? I know these 5 tasks, they might seem a little elusive, but I think they're really quite practical. They don't encompass maybe everything we have to do with our life, but they certainly give us some guidance, especially the last two, I think, where we really look at the need to focus on having a spiritual practice now and finding some meaning and purpose. Why are we here? What is it that we're embodied for? So, anyone? Right about at the end. So again, I do have this little prayer for the passing away of things that comes from the book by Lewis Richmond that I just mentioned a short while ago. Maybe we can kind of all say this together as we kind of think about what we've covered in this course, all of the impermanent things that we have to deal with, this prayer for the passing away of things. As everything ages and passes away, may each of us be kind to ourselves. As everything ages and passes away, may each of us accept joy and sorrow. As everything ages and passes away, may each of us be happy and at peace. Okay, thank you. All right. Any other comments, questions? We'll do another short little mini dedication before we conclude, but I just want to make sure if anyone wanted an opportunity to say anything that they didn't get a chance to. I realize I didn't get a chance to share the little exercise. It's a longer meditation, but it's kind of, again, I can make it available and you can do it on your own. Sometimes it's useful to be guided in it, but it's essentially about if you were in the situation where you were looking at your last days and kind of builds up to that, getting a diagnosis and having things move in a direction where it's going to be your actual last days. What are the sorts of things that you want or that you don't want? It's a useful way to get our head around some of those advanced directive things, even, but also to confront what is it going to be like to deal with that reality. If you go to the doctor next week, and they look at your blood work or something and say, hey, hate to tell you, there's something really serious going on here. We need to take a biopsy. We need to find what's happening. It's that type of exercise that, again, can be a little it unnerves us a little bit because it gets us into that tender place, that vulnerable place. But it's a good place to kind of explore it because it's all in the dimension of imagination. It's not necessarily you're going through it right now. It may prepare you for that reality and certainly prepare for death. So I'll throw it in with the materials as well. So you'll get a number of things, maybe too much information, but certainly, again, I recommend any of these other courses if you're interested in more on the Buddhist perspective. There's a course called Heart Advice for Death and Dying that the FPMT has. There's the Death and Rebirth module that Venerable Angie's still teaching. I think there's a few more sessions of that left, so you can join that. And some of the information may be similar, but let's go ahead and dedicate then. Again, our dedication is a way of taking all this positive energy that we've created through turning our minds towards this topic, spending this time together, whether we're again online or here in the Gompa, we've created this energy together. So we want to dedicate it together to the best possible results, to each of us, finding peace in our own lives around our death and our ability to lead others to having a peaceful death, for all beings, ourselves included, to eventually be free from death, to attain the state of peace, and even beyond that, the state of complete enlightenment. We dedicate also for the good health and long lives of these amazing gurus that are leading us on our path, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We also dedicate for the very quick return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, has passed away and is still yet to appear in a form that we can then benefit from again through his providing teachings and guidance to us and others in this world. And lastly, we dedicate for the beings that we're holding in our hearts. Every one of us knowing certain beings or even being aware of situations in the world that move our hearts, where we look at those and we really wish from the depths of our hearts that those beings were free from that suffering. Especially we can think about parts of the world where there's great suffering from war, from the elements, and so on. Send this positive energy you've created out to those beings so that it becomes the cause to immediately remove their suffering and to bring them all the causes of finding true peace and happiness. And may this be so for all beings through what we've done here together today and throughout this weekend. Okay, thank you all for the opportunity for me to go blah, blah, blah about this subject. I hope my blah, blah, blah was of some benefit. And yeah, there's 2 more evenings that I'm here of teachings on Monday and Wednesday, where we'll look at the science of happiness and kind of how do we cultivate many of these positive emotions, these that are really useful to counteract the negative states that we have. Thank you for being here, everyone online. Thank you, Urs, for your help from a distance. Stephen here, everyone participating. Appreciate it. Bye-bye. Okay.